Hey, welcome back. I want to get into a little bit more of dispersal and sort of the mechanisms of how that can relate to an organism or a species expanding its range over time and some of the different ways that can happen. There's a few different ways, and oh man, all of my numbers in this got messed up. I'm now realizing, not sure what happened there. Anyway, there's a few different ways that dispersal can occur, different methods of dispersal. So there's jump dispersal, which is sort of a one-time event where some organisms might, usually over a fairly long distance. It's not always what we might consider long distance dispersal, but it's usually a jump dispersal over some barrier, sort of a one-time event, and bam, all of a sudden you have a new population of organisms that show up. Diffusion dispersal is sort of a slower process where organisms show up and then sort of expand their range from there. And then secular migration is a little bit different in that it occurs over a really long time spans or a really long time period, and you sort of end up with a different species. Sometimes you end up with a different species than what occurred, in the original movement. Like it's movement over such a long period of time that sometimes the species evolves into a new species by the time it gets there. So let's talk a little bit about these. A cool story that I always like to mention is that in 1883, and maybe you've heard about this, a volcano erupted in the Krakatoa Islands and caused complete mortality. So this was a 100% wipeout of all life on these islands after this volcano erupted, just bathed everything in ash and smoke and fire and killed everything that was on these islands. But in only 50 years, so 50 years later, there was a tropical forest that had been established. And the species that showed up there showed up via jump dispersal because this was an island there, and it was a 100% mortality event. So there was nothing, there was no seed bank, there was no soil, it was just volcanic ash. And then 50 years later, bam, you have a rainforest that's back. And so there's a lot of things that have to occur there. You have to have some weathering and some soil creation, but then pretty quickly you could see that seeds and all sorts of other things showed up, and within 50 years you had a rainforest. So that's pretty astounding, and it was a really interesting way for us to learn about this because it's very rare that you have these sorts of events. It's not like we can go into an island and kill everything there. There's lots of morality issues with doing that. We wouldn't want to do that in the first place. So this was sort of a natural way to study some of these things. And it was really interesting. I don't think anyone expected these populations. So you can see here, and that's just what you're seeing on the figures here, how quickly the populations. So for plants, here's the number of species over time, 50, 60 years, you're seeing, 300, almost 300 species of plants, 30 species roughly of birds. So pretty quickly, and this is all jump dispersal because they're not. It's an island. It's not connected to anything. So this happens more often than what I think we previously thought or used to think in the past. And jump dispersal events are often followed by diffusion dispersal once a population is established. So this is the cattle egret that there was a jump dispersal event from Africa showed up in South America and then had a more gradual increase in its range. Still pretty rapid, but this is more the diffusion, whereas it's not going from here to somewhere in North America in one jump. It's sort of gradually working its way up there, stepping its way up. So that's more diffusion dispersal. But usually, that follows. So there was a jump dispersal event and then the gradual diffusion. And there's lots of examples of these. So European starling was introduced here in the U.S. somewhere in the early, either late 1800s or early 1900s, and then expanded its range through diffusion dispersal across North America. The house sparrow was introduced in the western United States in the late 1800s and expanded. There was actually two here. So in the later 1800s over here and sort of mid 1800s in the eastern United States, sort of expanded its range in multiple directions there in that way. And there's tons of these. So the American or yeah, muskrat in Europe was introduced, I think, in Prague, if I remember right, and expanded its range through diffusion across, I guess, sort of central Europe there. And then, the European rabbit in Australia, the red fox in Australia, those two are made their way in the 1800s. The nine-banded armadillo has been increasing its range, expanding its range northward throughout North America, even getting into Indiana at this point. And so, I mean, we're not going to go through every potential case because that's impossible. But another one worth mentioning is, this is an interesting example because this is an example of us. We do this a lot now. I think everyone's familiar with the term invasive species, like humans move stuff around all the time. The cane toad was introduced on purpose in Australia in 1935, and I think it was, if I remember right about this, I haven't read about this in a while, but I think there was a beetle or some insect that was a pest to people's crops there, and so they imported this cane toad, which was supposed to be a predator of, I think it was a beetle, of whatever this insect species was that was eating their crops. And so they introduced the cane toad to take care of that, and then the cane toad populations just exploded. I watched this when I was in college. I watched a documentary about this, and there was some funny footage of just like streets that were just covered in cane toads. They were everywhere, and I couldn't find the video. I don't know what happened to that. I'm not actually sure where they're at as far as population control, but it was an interesting example of why biological control can be more harmful than it is good if because you don't really know what's going to happen. So they introduced this cane toad as a way to control the population of this pest, this agricultural pest, and then the cane toad took off and just exploded huge population numbers and expanded to all sorts of areas in ways that they didn't expect or really want. So that's an interesting story. So that was jump dispersal and diffusion dispersal. Secular dispersal is a little bit different, and it's hard to kind of visualize. So I'm just going to give you a definition here. Secular dispersal is a large scale and long-term movement of species, such as the northern advancement of certain tree species following the retreat of the glaciers. So usually this is sort of response to some change in the environment, some large scale change like a continent moving around or glaciers expanding across a continent and then retreating. Usually that when that happens, you see these movements of species following the retreat of the glaciers, and we'll talk more about that. But tree species are pretty common with that, and sometimes it takes so long that you end up with different species than what you started with. So it's just a different type of scale that we're talking about there. Okay, so let's transition here a little bit. I want to talk about some mechanisms of movement and specifically how do organisms literally move around. And we can sort of categorize this into two different ways. One is active and one is passive. And I think people can sort of confuse these as far as, the active seems like it's a choice and passive seems like it's sort of just something that happens. And maybe that's true, but what's more important is about active requires energy. Passive requires very little energy. You're relying on some other thing, either the environment or some other type of organism is moving you around, so you're not really using your energy to do it. Whereas active, you are. So we'll start with active. And a lot of this is kind of intuitive, I think. So strong flyers tend to have the highest dispersal ability. There's organisms, birds can fly. There's other, types of bats can fly and things, but birds have some of the widest ranges. So we wouldn't really necessarily consider breeding range and winter ranges as sort of expanding your range, but it's traversing between these two things. And so, like some species are able to fly almost the entire latitudinal extent of the entire planet. This is pretty crazy. So that tends to be the case for flyers. They tend to be the best at dispersing. Just another example here: monarch butterflies are able to have huge migration. Everyone's familiar with the monarch sort of butterfly migration routes, and so that happens on a regular basis, but still pretty remarkable to think about how far those organisms move around. And so flyers tend to move around the most. And if we wanted to draw some general patterns, we could say, flying tends to be more efficient than swimming, which tends to be more efficient than walking. So if we look at this figure here, there's a few things going on here, so I'll walk you through this. First of all, we're looking at the migration distance, maximum migration distance for different types of organisms as a function of body mass. So how large is the body? And these are on log scales, which is why the units here are a little funky. But that's not super important. We just want to look at the general trends here. And what we can see is, regardless of what type of organism we're talking about, the maximum migration distance tends to increase as you increase in body mass or body size more generally. So the larger you are, you tend to be better at dispersing, but there's different patterns for what type of dispersing you're doing. And so on average, flyers tend to have a higher migration distance than either swimmers or walkers. And swimmers tend to be better than walkers, even though when you get way out here, there are some swimming organisms that disperse farther than some flyers. The highest observed is in flyers, and the average overall tends to be higher in flying organisms that can fly. So that tends to be the general pattern. Flying is more efficient than swimming, which is more efficient than walking. But that's all active dispersal, and that tends to be maybe what we're most familiar with or what's easiest to think about. But most organisms don't use active dispersal; they use passive dispersal. And plants are a great example of this. And no one knows how many types of plants there are, but almost all of them are going to use passive dispersal, and they've evolved a huge variety of different ways to do this. So, sometimes they rely on the wind, or sometimes they get stuck to other organisms to move around. They've evolved fruit, so ways to get organisms like us to eat them and then disperse the seeds as we digest them. Or other types of mechanisms where they might float or explode or whatever it is, all sorts of different methods here for passive dispersal. Insects at higher altitudes tend to be better, so there's sort of a cluster of organisms or insects that occur at really high altitudes, and so we would expect them to probably be better dispersers. And again, some insects can fly, and that tends to help, but there are actually some organisms that use passive, like there's families of spiders and some other types of organisms that sort of can spin webs and just kind of let the wind carry them. And so insects are kind of a weird thing, but there's this cluster of them at higher altitude, so we would expect them to be better dispersers. And another interesting, I forgot I included this, another interesting sort of example of odd dispersing is this cnidarian, not really a jellyfish, it's kind of a form of jellyfish, and it has two different forms. So basically it has this wind sail, and this species just kind of floats along the surface here. But it has these two different forms. One's a left sailing or right sailing sails. So the sails are oriented in different ways, and that dictates how they move around and what their actual geographic range is. So it's kind of interesting in that their morphology is going to actually dictate, because they're not really, they're passive, so they're just relying on the ocean and the wind currents here to move them around. And depending on what their morphology is, you actually get some different populations that exist. So kind of an interesting thing going on there with passive dispersal. Okay, so I'm going to finish up this video. There's a reading about some sort of the genetic implications of dispersal in organisms moving around. So read that and keep working your way through the module. I will see you in the next video.